Um, really excited that you've joined us for this webinar on the Cyber Resilience Act and its SBOM requirements featuring Olle Johansson. My name is Andy Drukarev. I'm from FOSSA. I'll be your host for today's discussion. Before I go over our agenda and introduce Olle, I'd like to cover some housekeeping points. First, please feel free to submit any questions you have in your On24 console. We will either answer them during the course of this webinar, or we will also have time for Q&A at the end. Next, the webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to you after the event. And we at FOSSA will also be following up with you with a few additional resources. Now, a quick word on today's agenda. So Olle will start by providing some background on the CRA, what prompted it, what its key provisions are, what its timeline for implementation is. We'll then pivot into a deep dive on SBOMs and the role they play in the CRA and vulnerability management as a whole. And then I'll have a few words at FOSSA toward the end and some of our relevant features. Now, super excited to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Olle Johansson. I suspect some of you on this webinar might already know Olle, but if you don't, he's a leading CRA and application security expert who is part of several OWASP working groups, including CycloneDX and the Transparency Exchange API. And Olle is also the organizer of the Nordic Software Security Summit. So with that, Olle, I'll hand things over to you to get us started.
Yeah, I started with a 20-year-old background in open source. I've been working a lot with the Asterisk open source project and the Camellia open source project. How do I end up talking about new legislation coming from the EU? Well, I work as a consultant with embedded systems, both in real-time communication and in other areas. And when CRA arrived on the scene a while ago, there was a lot of problems, both for open source and others, that have been changed. So I ended up spending a lot of time with the CRA, and I want to share with you the way I see the CRA, why it is important, and how it will actually affect how we work with software development for a long, long time. I'll also go down the path of SBOMs, which is a topic I really, really like. We are extremely excited now that the CycloneDX standard made it into an ECMA official standard this summer, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So what was the problem? Well, during the last couple of years, we all around the world have seen a lot of problems with cybersecurity. Up here in the cold north in Sweden, we had an issue that took one of the major grocery store chains down for a whole week, or if not even more. And the cost of that was really, really high, and has been proven to be way too low. So these disruptions that come all the time made the governments in Europe to start the discussions, and ended up with a proposal called the Cyber Resilience Act. And one apart from issues like with the Coop stores in Sweden, we have seen a lot of issues both with OpenSSL and Log4j, where there has been alerts that we have a zero-day vulnerability, an extremely important vulnerability in the Log4j code. And the problem was that customers didn't know if they had the issue. They didn't know if the Log4j was executing anywhere in their environments. So they started asking around, even with projects like Camellia, which is written in C and not in Java, Java library like Log4j. They asked us if we were affected because they just didn't know. So the industry, both customers and vendors, spent countless of hours trying to find out whether or not they were affected by a third-party software, an open source component. So the dependencies hurt, and our own software, the code that ties all these libraries together, security issues as well. I would love to say that bugs or possibly without any vulnerabilities, but you can never be sure. So both libraries, third-party components, and tools we use can have security issues. And a new problem that has been on the rise for the last couple of years is software supply chain attacks. That is when a bad actor injects code in a software development system, and the goal is not to affect the vendor, it's to actually attack the customer. One example of this is SolarWinds, where bad code with problematic risks were distributed to customers from the SolarWinds supply chain, signed by SolarWinds. So the number of hours we spend trying to find out if we're affected, and vendors saying almost all the time that this is a customer problem. The customers need to protect themselves. The customers need to be aware. That really irritated a lot of the government actors. So in the end, all over the world, we have seen various reactions to this, where the government, the state, wants to shift the balance from the software vendor to customers. And they say very clearly now that vendors need to focus on securing the customer software and the customer environments and prioritize cybersecurity much, much higher than new cool features. And during a lot of years, I've been working as a contractor in various projects, and I've seen personally all the issues I open in Jira about security related to security issues. They never get priority. But now the government is saying that these issues, they really need priority, and they're changing the regulation for that. And the software industry have never been regulated, not at least not as long as I've been working with it, which is about 50 years now. So this is a huge change that will affect us all, both customers and vendors. So with the Cyber Resilience Act, the EU wants to protect the citizens. They want the citizens to get insight before purchase. They want the citizens to get security updates for free and automatically. Because they're saying that by protecting the society, protecting the EU market from vulnerable software and vendors that doesn't patch, doesn't fix vulnerabilities, the cost for society will go down. They realize that the cost of the software, but the cost of society, when looking at all the incidents we have, not just Log4j or SolarWinds, but all others with ransomware and all kinds of attacks on our infrastructure. The inner EU market needs to be protected. So the CRA really affects not only EU manufacturers, but everyone wants to sell a product on the EU market, regardless of where you're based. And that's very important to remember when looking at the Cyber Resilience Act, that it affects everyone around the world that wants to sell software on the EU market.
Great, thank you, Ollie, for that awesome kind of context on the concerns that led into the CRA. For folks who are just joining us, we are currently off video to maximize the audio quality, so thank you for your patience. But now that we have sort of that background of some of the pain and problems that led to the CRA's creation. Ollie, wondering if you could now speak to some of the core tenets of the CRA. What kind of goes into it, and what the requirements are, timelines are, things of that nature.
Absolutely, Andy. Let's look at the CRA and try to understand what some of the main topics in the CRA. Of course, CRA is a huge legislation, and there will be a lot of additional documents coming very soon. So let's take a summary. One of the first and most important issues with the CRA is to shift responsibility back to the manufacturer. Manufacturers can't say that, oh, the customers need to protect themselves. The firewalling and security is a customer issue, it's not a vendor issue. By changing the regulation, the EU is saying that customers need better protection and vendors need to take responsibility for this. Products will need to be secure by design and secure by default. Secured by default means that you can't have admin logins on products anymore, and the basic settings have to be at highest security, not with security disabled. Secure by design means that a product has to be secure from the creation on the whiteboard. The first couple of ideas, security needs to be an integrated part, and we need to take care of the product during the complete lifetime and maintain a high security level. They're saying that customers have the right to get free security updates, and this is during a product's expected lifetime. The vendor can't really decide the product's lifetime. That has to be done in cooperation with market authorities. But during the expected lifetime, any customer have the right to free security updates. And it should preferably be automatic updates. Customers have the right to disable the automation, but automation needs to be there. And there are a few cases that came in the last proposals where a vendor, if they have really, really strong arguments, can avoid to implement the automatic updates. But you need really, really good arguments in order to do that. And a manufacturer need to keep users informed about all the vulnerabilities, exploits, and necessary updates in their products. So transparency is important. And all the security updates you do has to be published publicly, not just to your users. It has to be publicly available. This adds to the well-known CE certification for all the software. All the hardware that you connect to the networks or to the power grid has to be CE certified on the EU market, and it has been that way for a very long time. Anything we buy here in the EU have a certificate on compliance with it and a CE mark on the actual product. So the EU is expanding the CE mark to include the software. And the software now has to be secure by default and secure by design. And customers will need to be, they will need the ability to make an informed choice. So a lot of information has to be published before purchase. Now, if you're not a manufacturer, but you import products and sell on the EU market, or you distribute from abroad, then you're liable as a manufacturer. And this is really important and will affect many, many companies. So anyone that imports or distributes products, everything from toys or IoT sensors to complex server systems, games, other things, will have to make sure that the product follows the CE marking. And you have to look not only on the product you sell, you have to look into your software supply chain, because software supply chain attacks are on the rise. So you need to look into the whole supply chain and maintain them so they are secure And this will really change a lot on how we work with DevOps, DevSecOps, CI/CD tool chains, other things. We have to verify all the components, all the products, all the Docker containers that we use to build and test and run our software. And the whole Cyber Resilience Act is based on a risk assessment. So for each product, you start with doing a risk assessment, you document the expected use, and you can't really limit what is reasonable use on the market. So if you sell a toaster, you can't say that, oh, you're not allowed to put bread in it, just to limit your liability. But do a proper risk analysis, and you have to keep that up to date during the product's lifetime. And the product's lifetime is not really the time you sell it until you set end of life. It's the time the customers have the products in use in their network. So, when is this going to happen? That's a very important question. Well, the legislation have passed all the hoops through the union. In the EU, we have the Council, we have the Parliament, and we have the Commission, and they have all agreed that this is important. They have agreed on the same text. During the summer now, lawyers and translators are working with the text to produce the final version in all the EU languages. And we expect, if nothing else happens, that the publication, the final approval will happen in the September-October timeframe by publishing the legal text in the official journal of the European Union. After that, we have two steps. The first one is 21 months after the publication. Don't ask me why they ended up with 21 months. We expected either 18, 1.5 years, or 2 years. I think it's a compromise between them. At that point in time, any vendor for all products sold needs to have a complete vulnerability handling, needs to handle issues in the products, needs to be able to handle reports if there is an exploit in their product in the customer base, and report that to authorities. 3 years after publication, all new or upgraded products needs to be fully CE compliant, needs to be secure by design, secure by default. And 3 years is a very, very short time if you need to evaluate a large product range, and in some cases also replace products by taking some of them out of production, out of distribution, and building whole new ones. And during this time, you also have to go through with all your upstream vendors, both commercial and open source, and see where they are and how much you can trust them doing your thing, their thing, because you will be liable for your customers for the complete product. And that is very important. You're liable for the open source components and the third-party commercial components. So basically, again, I'm repeating myself a bit. What the EU is saying here is that manufacturers can no longer say that security is a customer issue. It is now a vendor issue. If you want to sell products on the market, they have to be cyber secure, and you have to maintain the product. You have to keep it secure. And they're also saying very clearly that the transition period of 21 months, which is extremely short, provides a clear direction for R&D investments, meaning prioritize cybersecurity, deprioritize new, cool, sexy features unless you get more development budget. And during this time, every single product, both old and new, needs a complete SBOM in order to handle the vulnerability issues. And vendors need to be more transparent. They need to tell customers when there are problems. they need to publicly go out with the security fixes they apply to their product. They need to contact authorities, and they need to be able to receive reports from customers and researchers about vulnerabilities in their own code or third-party code they distribute. So, which products? Well, there are products that already have regulations like medical, military, and cars, and the CRA doesn't apply to that, but the rest of the market, it does. Cloud services is excluded because in the European Union cybersecurity legislation, NIS 2 covers a lot of the cloud services and online services. The only exception here is if you sell a software that depends on a cloud service. You sell a game, a local game app that relies on a backend service in the cloud, then the backend service also will be managed under the Cyber Resilience Act. But a software as a service that is standalone, have no local hardware, no local applications, they will be excluded. But everything from mobile apps, games, embedded systems, Mac and PC software, server software, databases, all of it is included here in the Cyber Resilience Act. The Cyber Resilience Act is kind of an interesting legislation. When reading law text, a lot of the people creating these documents try to make it long-term, make the text not be very specific for the current time. With the CRA, there's a lot of stuff in the text that will get old very quickly. So we have to expect that the CRA will get regular updates. One part that is under discussion currently, because they're writing a lot of implementation guides. There's been meetings this week in the EU, open meetings to discuss, is the classification of products. They estimate that 90% of the product will go into what they call the default category, which is like most of the CE marking as a self-certification. You make sure by using internal processes or standards that you are compliant and you mark your products with a CE mark. But for a few critical systems in various classes, there will either be a third-party certification or an approval of other certifications as compliant with the Cyber Resilience Act. We've seen the first certification from the new certification from the EU, which is called the EUCC, Common Criteria. That has been published because it's used also by other regulations in the EU. But expect the classification to change and change quickly. There is a process for changing it within the legal text. So you have to be a bit careful here, and we still have to figure out how to monitor these changes, find out where they are going to be published and how the industry will actually be aware of what's happening. If their product suddenly is moved from a default category to a critical category, you need to know. Like I said before, there are two phases of the Cyber Resilience Act. The first one is focused on the vulnerabilities and how to receive them, how to monitor vulnerabilities by using SBOMs. We'll talk more about that soon. And how to inform your customers and authorities. This applies to all products that is sold on the market, regardless if it's old products or new products. If you sell a product on the market, you have to manage vulnerabilities from that point on. And this is very interesting because some products I've been working with in the past, it's really, really hard to figure out if we have the code, if we have the tools to build it, what kind of dependencies is used, and so on. So you have to go through your products and examine whether or not you can create a proper SBOM, whether or not you can apply a vulnerability handling process to this product. If you can't, well, that product have to go out of distribution very soon and be replaced. Phase 2 is the full CRA. And that will apply to all new products launched on the market, but also products that receive a significant update. If you add functionality to a product and continue selling it, the whole product, even the old parts of the code, has to be CE compatible, CRA compatible. And that is, well, like we said, secure the supply chain, build secure products, and prioritize cybersecurity. So again, the focus is to transparency, secure by design, and manage and fix vulnerabilities. But also the customer's insight. And for many companies, the communication department needs to be involved here, because if you haven't really communicated any security issues or discussed your product security with customers, this is going to be a huge change. And you need to manage that communication change, but with people that have communication skills, because it's going to be very, very interesting, and maybe for some customers shocking if they've been buying your products for a long time and suddenly you have to go out every week or several times a month with security reports. They're going to be scared and try to think about what happened with this one. So within the company, for each product, you need to make a declaration of conformance. If you're already selling hardware on the EU market, you know this process. There's not a lot of changes there. If you really want to get certified, there will be many ways to check either self-certification or third-party certification. You can choose to just read the CRA and say that, well, yeah, I understand this, but that's very tricky. Because by reading the legal text, you have to read a lot of other text to understand, because they added a lot of expressions and stuff in there that is legalese following the EU new legislation language, as documented as something they call the Blue Guide. But you can do self-certification based on that. There will also be a lot of horizontal standards from CNCNLEC and other parties. We're working with something now within the Eclipse Foundation here in Europe, together with a lot of other open source foundations and open source developers like me, like UVASP has joined, OpenSSF has joined, Linux Foundation has joined, matrix.org has joined. We're trying to create a horizontal standard for open source projects. But you can also choose to get certified by a third party, and who they are and when they will be ready, it's something we'll know hopefully very soon. As I said, the text is interesting because they have a lot of details in it. In the first proposal from the Commission, it has been cleared up, but this picture is from the first Commission proposal. They had a lot of text and expressions that wasn't explained anywhere. Secure by design, what is that? Really, from a legal point of view? How do you talk with your compliance people and say whether or not you're secure by design? They also talk here in 3F about mitigate DOS attacks. Well, how much? How big? What kind of DOS attacks? So there's a lot of questions here in the text, but they're trying hard, and we'll see what happens when we get more implementation guidelines and we get more horizontal standards. But if you understand the basics here, if you understand the meaning behind the regulation, you can find out what to do in the meantime. And the important thing here is that when we create software today, we use a lot of third-party components, and a lot of those components are open source. And that's why open source is so important in light of the Cyber Resilience Act. About 90% of the code in products that are sold on the market is open source. So 10% of the code is your proprietary code that actually does the business logic that you sell. And this means that we will have a whole new relationship between manufacturers and open source projects. And the legislation, the first proposal, was really, really bad for open source because they tried to make open source projects liable according to law. And that would have been very damaging to open source. But luckily, the EU Commission opened their ears. They listened really, really hard to argumentation from the open source world. And the open source world started acting as lobbyists, working together, having one voice and one proposal. So the second proposal was much, much better and acceptable for open source. So what happens if you continue to sell products and don't do the right things, or if you ignore reports and actually cause harm to your customers? Well, they set the bar so high. So the fines here go to 15 million euros or 2.5% of the worldwide annual turnover. This is so high. It's higher than the GDPR and other legislations. So it makes CRA a board issue. It's a direction issue that needs to be handled on that level because of the risk you take here. So what do you need to do? Well, you need to look at all your current products, and in a very, very short time, because you have 21 months, 2 years from now, I will guess, if you include the summer, to define the gap and start acting. The big question here is it possible to make current products compliant? So the new legislation here, the new regulation, will likely be in place all over the EU at the same time this year. It's an act, so it doesn't have to be translated and implemented in each country's local laws. It applies to the whole union at the same time. In the first step, the vulnerability handling needs to be in place, and SBOM is mandatory, but publishing to users is not. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a while. In the second step, secure by design, this means that cost per dependency will rise. If you include a lot of components, you will have to maintain them during your product's lifetime. And that's the lifetime at customer sites, not your selling time. And you have to find a new way to communicate with your customers because transparency is required by law. So we're in a hurry. If you haven't started, you have a very short time to get the act together. And that's most of what I wanted to say about the CRA.
Excellent. No, that's a wonderful, comprehensive recap. Thanks so much, Ollie. And, as we move forward kind of in the second part of this webinar, would love to dive into one of the specific kind of sections of it, which talk about SBOM, software bill of materials. And so, Ollie, I'll turn things back over to you to get into the heart of our SBOM conversation.
Oh, that's cool. I like leaving the world of legislations and going to technology, Andy. That's where my heart is. So let's talk about SBOMs. And let's talk a little bit about me. I want to get a bit personal here when talking about this, because this is something I care about. I'm an open source developer, I mentioned that. Cybersecurity apprentice. I've been working with PKI, TLS, and that kind of stuff for a long time. I'm active in the IETF and open source project, OWASP, and much more. Live out in Sollentuna, north of Stockholm, Sweden. I own a beautiful dog that you see on the picture with a lot of snow, because we have snow in the winter. But I'm also lactose intolerant. I can't handle dairy products. And that means when I go out to buy food, I have to read the small text on every package to see if there's any milk, any dairy in the products. I have to do that all the time, because even if I buy the same product as last week, the vendors can change the ingredients. Now, I have more allergies. I'm also suffer from a curl allergy. You know CRA? This is a tool and a library that we all use to fetch web stuff. Web components, web pages, use APIs. It's a library that exists in every car, every game, everywhere. And being allergic to that, I really need to know. I need to have the fine text to see if there's any curl inside a product. So if I go out shopping, like look at all this stuff, how do I know if there's curl inside? I don't, because the vendors here doesn't tell me the ingredients of their software. And this is a big problem. If I'm the customer and we have a new Log4j issue coming up, I want to be in control. I want to know at that moment I hear about a new Log4j, I really want to know where I have it. Where do I have the vulnerable components? Where do I have curl if there's a new really bad issue with curl or Log4j? And this was the whole dilemma when Log4j hit the world, that we didn't know. Many vendors didn't know if Log4j was in their product. Many customers had no clue whether they have Log4j and if they were in a vulnerable position with their e-shops, with their software supply chains, with their web pages or anything. So as a customer, I want to know what's in the products I buy. And as a vendor, I now have a legal obligation to know which components I use in every single product to be able to fix and maintain the security of those products. And of course, we can't do this manually. We can't have Excel spreadsheets and look them up as a product manager. It just doesn't scale. We need to automate all of this. And this is a really cool area to be right now, because new things are happening all the time. And we'll hear soon from FOSSA that you did actually launch new products, new services, but so does the whole world. Both open source and commercial vendors launch automation, and we work in standard communities to actually standardize protocols and file formats. So we have standardized data formats. We have a lot of new software. We have scanners that try to figure out the components, the ingredients, if you like to say so, of any piece of software. We also have third-party assessments of open source projects, because you need to know whether an open source project you use is alive, if they actually update when there's a security issue and report security issues as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on. I have spent a lot of time in the little dark gray box in the corner there, because I saw that the protocols were missing. And being an old IETF developer, been working with standardization of TCP/IP protocols for a long time, I think this is an area where I can contribute. And I know we mentioned something called the Transparency Exchange API earlier. And if you Google for that, you'll find out that that's a project we're working on within OWASP to define a protocol and a standardized way of downloading artifacts. But the most critical tool here is the SBOM, the software bill of materials. This is the list of ingredients in your software. You use it to track vulnerabilities. There are two different formats that are, I would say, the main formats, SPDX from the Linux Foundation and Cyclone DX from OWASP. Both are today international standards. And you have many usages of this. It started with open source license compliance, but now a lot of the focus, because of legislations like the CRA and other legislations worldwide, the focus now is vulnerability and vulnerability handling. We often talk about SBOM as it was only one single SBOM. I won't go through this in detail, but I just wanted to mention that there are many different SBOMs. In some cases, you need to include your build tools, your compilers, your test tools, your Git repository software, your test software, everything. But then you also have an SBOM for the components you actually hand over to a customer. And that external SBOM is really important. You have to sign it digitally. It's fixed for each and every version of your software. And it will include all the upstream SBOMs, the components from other vendors that you include in your software. And the question here is, how are you getting them? And how are you getting information here? Can you expose the vendor SBOMs to your customers? There are some cases where upstream vendors say that, no, you can't do that, this is under NDA, and so on and so forth, which may become illegal under regulations coming. So there's a lot of minds that need to change, and a lot of processes that need to change here. But all these SBOMs are used to query vulnerability databases. And there are several ones. The biggest one is the CV database that is also published under the name MVD. And there are both commercial and open source systems to validate your SBOM, your list of components, with vulnerability databases to see if there are any current problems that you need to fix in your software. As a customer, I have a software inventory database that will now have also all the SBOMs. So you can query and find out, where do you have problems? And if another log4j comes, you can actually then manage this and say that, well, it affects all the printers, but I can turn them off. But our web shopping system that faces the internet needs all the headcount, all the priorities, because that's a real high priority to fix. But at least we have the data as a customer if we have the SBOMs. An SBOM can contain a lot of different things, but there are minimum requirements. And since we haven't seen the minimum requirements for the CRA, we can only look around and see what other governments are saying. And this is from the US government, minimum requirements on SBOM. And one very important thing here is the name and the relationships. I showed an SBOM earlier on earlier slides as a kind of family tree trickling down. So you need to understand the dependencies, which component that depends upon another component. But this name is what we use when looking up in the vulnerability database. And that name has turned out to be a problem. In the past, in the National Vulnerability Database, the vendor didn't decide the name. So someone else in the US government did. And that means that Microsoft have, as a vendor, have many different names, and their products, each one have many different names in the database, which makes matching very, very hard to complete. So if an SBOM says curl, well, we have many curls to verify with. And this is something we spent in the community a lot of time working on. And we all agree that the package URL is a name definition that covers most of these use cases. And the package URL is now part of the ECMA standardization we're operating within OWASP. We formed a working group for the package URL to become an international standard through ECMA. And not every SBOM you get is a good SBOM, especially if you run a scanner and you get some output, or if you get something from a vendor, you really have to look hard into it and see, does it meet the minimal requirements? Does it actually have all components listed? And there's a lot of work going on to build various automation here to judge whether or not it's a quality SBOM. I won't go through in detail the various standards, but SPDX is one of them. It's an ISO standard. It's a project which is part of the Linux Foundation. And Cyclone DX come from OWASP. They can both do all the basic stuff, but then when you add something extra, they kind of compete and add new things. In the latest version of Cyclone DX, there was integration of a cryptography bill of materials and attestations, which is really important moving forward. But we're happy that we become an ECMA standard in June this year. But when you start working with this and you download a scanner, an open source scanner, or if you get to test a commercial scanner, you just have to realize that your first SBOM, it will stink. It's not going to be good. They are, some cases they use, if you scan a container, they just use the list of installed packages. But if you install stuff any other way, it will totally miss that. You could have really bad naming or bad licensing. So you need to start learning and figure out, because there's a lot of areas where SBOM fails in this. So there's a lot of handiwork here. You need to really work hard to get a proper SBOM and what I call a baseline SBOM that will be your kind of master that you check all the scanners with. And the SBOM is really at the core of a process where you build an inventory of all the products, you check that with a vulnerability database, and for each vulnerability you have to make an assessment whether or not this affects your users. And if it does, you have to come up with a mitigation process. If it doesn't, because there could be vulnerability in libraries in part of the code you don't execute in your product, then you also have to tell users that, well, we are aware of this, but according to what we see, it won't affect you at all. So, to summarize, the CRA doesn't really mandate customer access to SBOM data, but there is a lot of discussion on, especially for those that require third-party certification, that authorities need access to your SBOMs in order to monitor the quality of your products and vulnerabilities. So the CRA have very loose text about SBOMs, and we'll see in the implementation guides in the horizontal standards what happens here. But it's very clear, you will need an SBOM. And since you're liable for all vulnerabilities in all your components, regardless of the text in the CRA that says that, oh, you have to have an SBOM at least of the primary components, in reality, you need a complete SBOM, as complete as you can make it for your product, because you're liable for all vulnerabilities. So we need to work together here to form best current practice. We need to keep our customers secure. So please join the IETF work, OpenSSF, SPDX, OWASP, and help us. There's a lot of work to be done. here in a very, very short time. So with that, I say thank you. Added a couple of pointers here. This fall, I'm organizing a conference on the topic of CRA and the changes for the software industry, both from a business standpoint and technical standpoint. Andy mentioned that earlier. It's called the Nordic Software Security Summit. And with that, Andy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Ollie. That was a wonderful presentation, and I think, answered a lot of questions that I know we've heard from people around the Cyber Resilience Act. So we do have approximately 6 minutes left in this webinar. At this point, if you have questions that you haven't asked, I know we had a bit of a back and forth in the chat, but you can feel free to ask them. I will also briefly just go through a little bit about FOSSA, who we are and what we do. So we have an SBOM management, as well as an open source vulnerability management and open source license compliance solution. The thing I kind of want to call out, there's two things I want to call out here. One, starting yesterday, we just totally changed our free product to basically make it so that you can do what you need to do from an SBOM management perspective and from a vulnerability management perspective. So if you are curious, I would encourage you to sign up for that. You can access the link in the related content module in your On24 console. In that same location, there's a link to Ollie's LinkedIn where you can connect with him. And Ollie, not to speak for you, but if people have questions, figure they could reach out to you on LinkedIn.
Absolutely.
Great.
I enjoy discussing these issues, so please do.
Excellent. Then just a few quick kind of high-level notes on what you can do with our product when it comes to SBOMs. So we really like to think of ourselves as sort of a full cycle solution, starting with generating SBOMs. We inventory your open source dependencies. Then, you can sort of annotate SBOMs when it comes to if there are vulnerabilities that are associated with, say, an open source component, but you've already remediated them. You can make a note in our product, and that will be then exported into your SBOM or some sort of a VEX statement. We also ingest SBOMs from third-party suppliers. So this goes, I think, to Ollie's point about the external SBOM having this full picture. It's not just your open source. It's not just the code your developers write. It's also if you have software suppliers, getting SBOMs from them and consolidating it, and then inventorying all kind of vulnerabilities across that full stack. And then we also have kind of a sharing portal that you can use. And this might come in handy if you do need to give an SBOM to some sort of a surveillance authority or a customer to do it in a secure way. So with that, I think maybe one kind of final question here. Well, two, actually. One is, will companies, Ollie, in your view, consider leaving the EU market because of the CRA's requirements?
I've heard many such suggestions, but the problem is that almost every global market will have regulations like this. Even China and Russia is looking into doing this. So it will be very hard finding a market where you can ignore the customer security in the future. But of course, we will see a lot of products disappearing from the shelves, at least for a short while. Many products imported by the electronics industry or games or toys. But I'm pretty sure McDonald's toys will be CE certified even in the future.
There you go. Last thing I have at this point, and you touched on this when you mentioned that sort of there initially was some controversy around how the CRA treated open source, but sort of in once there were some revisions that changed that. But wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how the CRA treats open source, how the provisions impact open source software.
Well, that was very interesting, that process, because when approaching the EU, the Commission, the people who actually wrote the CRA, they realized that, well, the rest of the industry, they lobby and come to us, but the open source guys, they work with their code and doesn't come to us. So they actually participated in the EU's largest open source convention, FOSSA, in Brussels in February for 2 years in a row. And they listened a lot, and many open source projects spearheaded by the Eclipse Foundation have worked with them. So in the current legislation, there is no, I would say, clear liability monetary-wise. There are requirements on open source, and we're trying to find that out. They defined a new role, which we're trying to figure out in a working group in the Eclipse Foundation, what it means, something called the open source steward. But it's very clear that it is acceptable now, but open source projects also needs to focus on security. What's going to be interesting is the relationship between a vendor that uses an open source component and the open source project. Good days, when I'm in a good mood, I believe that funding will come from the vendors to open source project to help us work with security and implement new features in a secure way. Bad days, I'm worried that they will send legal people and lawyers with bad mails threatening us. But hopefully we'll see a better cooperation and a better way of working together in the future.
Yeah, I think for me and probably a lot of people, the first time we heard actually of the CRA was, following the controversy around open source, and there was, I know, an outcry from the community. So fascinating to hear that there was actually an interaction at FOSSA that I did not know that. So with that, we have reached. Go ahead, Olle.
Go on. No, I said, well, in the beginning, many foundations like the Python Foundation basically said we won't distribute anything in Europe anymore. But I think that has calmed down now, and we're all good working together with the Commission to actually handle these issues. So it's looking good.
Excellent. Well, we are now at time. Thank you so much to everyone who is here today watching this webinar. We hope you found it useful. Like I said, feel free to reach out to Olle on LinkedIn. We'll also be following up over email. You can respond to us there. We'll also share the link to Olle's LinkedIn there as well. If you're watching this on demand, which I know due to the timing, a lot of people will be, I hope you've enjoyed the webinar there as well. So with that, we will close this conversation. Obviously, a lot more to come on the CRA in the months ahead. And Olle is the expert on this. So we're super grateful that you've joined us and shared your insight today.
And we're going to have a lot of discussions on the Nordic Software Security Summit in September in Stockholm. So I hope to see many of you there.
Yes, and in our follow-up emails that you should get in the next couple of days, we will make sure to include a link to that conference so you can learn more about it. Great. Well, with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thanks again, Olle. Thanks again to everyone for being here, and have a great rest of your Tuesday. Take care, everyone.
Bye now.